Naturally, this included Peter as well. Eleanor Reed feigned illness and did not attend, while Amelia Blake and Kevin Blake, her siblings, didn't even bother showing up. The old matriarch didn't say much about it, instead allowing the concubines and their children to come forward and greet Clara. She then instructed the steward to visit Eleanor Reed's chambers with a message. Since she was unwell, she should focus on her recovery and hand over the keys to the storeroom. Clara, though newly returned, needed to begin preparing her dowry. Hearing this, Eleanor Reed was so enraged she nearly fainted. Clara had only just returned and already had her eyes on the storeroom. Did they think she was a ghost that could be so easily dismissed? She was unwilling to relinquish control over the household, but she knew she couldn't outmaneuver the old matriarch. She hid the storeroom keys on her person, knowing the old matriarch wouldn't resort to forcibly seizing them. However, she understood this wasn't a long-term solution. That seemingly kind elderly woman was, in truth, a formidable opponent. Even the maids and servants in her courtyard were skilled, capable of subduing the entire estate if necessary. Left with no other choice, Eleanor Reed sent someone to summon the Marquis back to the estate. At this point, only he could stand against the old matriarch. William Blake rushed home, and upon hearing the situation, grew deeply concerned. He knew his mother's temperament well. She was indifferent unless she decided to intervene, and once she did, no one could oppose her. Although he was the head of the estate and the Marquis appointed by the Emperor, he was acutely aware of his position. Without the backing of the fourth prince's household and the old matriarch's influence, how could a mere illegitimate son like him have become the Marquis? The problem was that the storeroom was no longer what it used to be. Eleanor Reed gripped the bronze key tightly, her beautiful face darkening with malice. She dismissed the servants, leaned in close to William Blake, and whispered, "My lord, I have a plan. If she won't let us live in peace, then we should neither hold back nor hesitate." William Blake shook his head. "No, if she dies, I'll have to observe mourning rites, which would harm my prospects." Eleanor Reed sneered. "She doesn't need to die. We just need to make her neither fully alive nor dead. That way, you won't have anything to worry about." Her hatred for the old matriarch ran deep. If it weren't for that old woman's interference, she would have long since become the legitimate lady of the house and wouldn't have to endure Clara Blake's mockery. In the end, William Blake nodded. He didn't hold much affection for the old matriarch. Years ago, when she allowed him to inherit the title of Marquis, he hadn't felt any gratitude. In his eyes, she had only chosen him out of necessity, unable to find a more suitable candidate. Furthermore, his biological mother had been the old matriarch's maid, a maid who betrayed her mistress. This complicated relationship left him estranged from the old matriarch. That evening, during a family dinner, Clara Blake presented William Blake with a list of dowry items provided by the fourth prince. "Father, grandfather said these are the dowry items mother left behind after her passing. He has agreed to let me use them as my own dowry." William Blake took the list, already knowing its contents without needing to read it. Years ago, he had reluctantly signed an agreement allowing the fourth prince to hold on to the dowry, even stamping it with his seal. "What belongs to you will always be yours," he said. "When the time comes for your marriage, it will all be given to you. Why bring this up now?" William Blake was visibly upset, glancing at Eleanor Reed, who gave a slight nod. His gloomy mood somewhat improved. "We must do an inventory, just in case someone has been up to no good. If there's any loss, this old woman will have a hard time explaining to the fourth prince." The old matriarch cast a sharp look at Eleanor Reed, causing her to shrink back slightly. The Blake estate only appeared imposing on the surface. Since the old Marquis passed away, the estate had gradually declined, relying solely on the remnants of the old Marquis's prestige. Although William Blake held an official position, it was merely a nominal post with little income. The family's assets had also dwindled due to poor management. Eleanor Reed, known for her extravagant spending, had long dipped into Clara Blake's dowry. The cash was gone, turned into Eleanor's private funds, and the farmlands and shops had been transferred to her and her children. What remained in the storeroom were merely some household items, neither useful nor sellable. Seeing William Blake pretend not to hear, Eleanor Reed remained silent. The old matriarch merely snorted, refraining from further comment, and began her meal. Madame Wang promptly served the old matriarch a small bowl of 5-treasure abalone porridge. Eleanor Reed's son, Kevin Blake, seeing this, ordered a servant to fetch him a bowl as well, but Eleanor quickly stopped him. "That's the old matriarch's favorite dish. You should eat something else," she said, placing a piece of fish into his mouth. The old matriarch said nothing, instead handing the bowl of abalone porridge to Clara Blake. "Clara, this used to be your favorite dish." Madame Wang quickly served the old matriarch another small bowl. Only then did the old matriarch pick up her white porcelain spoon and take a few small bites. Clara Blake lifted the bowl of abalone porridge to her nose, inhaling its aroma. It was indeed fragrant, but there seemed to be a peculiar smell mixed in. After a moment of thought, her expression suddenly changed to one of horror. She turned to look at the old matriarch, who had already consumed nearly half the bowl. "There's poison in the porridge," she exclaimed, rushing forward to knock the bowl from the old matriarch's hands. She swiftly sealed the old matriarch's pulse points to prevent the poison from spreading further. Clara Blake glared at Eleanor Reed and William Blake, her fury blazing. It must have been this treacherous pair who orchestrated this. If anything happened to the old matriarch, Clara vowed to make them pay with their lives. In this moment, William Blake, a 4th-rank martial artist, felt an immense pressure, an overwhelming aura from a powerful individual, making him tremble inwardly. Was this aura coming from Clara Blake? He wasn't sure as he looked at Clara Blake, only to see her and Madame Wang quickly assisting the old matriarch out. However, Clara Blake's departure did not take away the suffocating pressure that nearly crushed him. He glanced around and saw that aside from Peter Blake, the others were women and children he was very familiar with. He looked at Peter Blake with a hint of fear in his eyes. Could it be him? He shook his head. Impossible. He's just a child, how could he emit such a strong aura? Peter Blake clenched his fists tightly before slowly releasing them, his small lips pressed together before finally relaxing. He stood up, grabbed a large chicken drumstick, and casually walked away. Seeing his mother's anger earlier, he almost took action, but unfortunately, he didn't know who had poisoned the food. If he did, he would have certainly taught that person a lesson. In an show hall, the old matriarch had taken the medicine Clara Blake prepared. Luckily, it was discovered in time, so no harm was done. Thinking back to the scene where Eleanor Reed stopped her son from eating the porridge, it was likely Eleanor Reed's doing. She then noticed that William Blake's expression hadn't changed at all. He must have known about it too. Disappointment was evident on the old matriarch's face. Although she had no maternal bond with William Blake, they had shared the same boat for so many years. Yet, he was so heartless. She thought to herself, if he could be cruel to his own flesh and blood, then to an old woman with no blood relation to him, what couldn't he do? Thinking like that, she also felt relieved. Clara Blake, do you resent your father? The old lady leaned against a soft pillow embroidered with golden threads. Noticing Clara Blake's complexion didn't look too well, she asked. Clara Blake shook her head and replied, not exactly resentful. Between him and me, there's no such thing as a father-daughter bond, so naturally, there's no resentment. The old lady seemed very satisfied with this answer. What she feared most was Clara Blake being heartbroken after seeing her father's true nature. This was a relief. Grandmother, you must be more cautious in the future. Eleanor Reed will certainly not give up and will definitely look for another opportunity to harm you. The old lady gently patted the back of Clara Blake's hand and slowly said, Clara Blake, don't worry about your grandmother. I will ensure you regain everything that belongs to you, find you a good family, and see you settle down in happiness. Clara Blake couldn't help but feel touched. In the 5 years she had been in this world, aside from her maternal grandfather, only her grandmother truly cared for her. Late at night, under the cold moonlight, a shadow as swift as a black streak moved into Blake Estate. The figure moved quickly, heading straight to Clara Blake's quarters. Inside the room, Clara Blake's previously closed eyes suddenly opened wide, her gaze icy. She gently moved her son's small hand resting on her arm, quietly leapt off the bed, and with a flick of her hand, extinguished the only light in the room. At that moment, a dark figure slipped in through the slightly open window. Clara Blake swiftly turned her palm, white energy burst forth from it, and her body gracefully ascended, unleashing a powerful strike toward the figure whose face was concealed by a black scarf. In the darkness, no one could clearly see each other, relying only on the breath to attack. The opponent seemed unwilling to confront Clara Blake directly, merely dodging. The shadow flickered, skillfully evading Clara Blake's next attack, and darted straight toward the bed. Clara Blake panicked, hurriedly flying forward to block the way, but saw the shadow move like lightning, lifting Peter from the bed. The palm strike aimed at the shadow quickly shifted direction to avoid harming Peter. Who are you? Put him down. Clara Blake, like an enraged lioness, glared at the figure in the darkness. The person carefully held Peter, seemingly inexperienced in carrying a child, worried about holding him uncomfortably. The movements appeared stiff and almost comical. So quick to forget me? But I remember you very well. The man spoke in a deep, pleasant voice, deliberately lowering his volume, as if afraid of waking Peter, who was sound asleep. That voice, it was unmistakably someone from the Heaven's Flame Hall. Those eyes that resembled Peter's by 80%, who exactly was he? What was his purpose in coming here? Julian Quinn. Clara Blake stared intently at Peter in his arms, her hands forming a seal, ready to strike at any moment. A faint smile appeared on Julian Quinn's face, hidden beneath the black scarf, seemingly pleased that Clara Blake had not forgotten him. Miss Blake, don't worry, I won't harm Peter. He tightened his grip on the arm holding Peter. In the darkness, although Peter's face was not clearly visible, the sound of his steady breathing and the faint scent of medicine emanating from the child made his chest inexplicably tighten. Master Quinn, why aren't you staying in your Sky Splitter Hall? What brings you here? Clara Blake couldn't afford to let her guard down. What exactly was this man scheming? If it came to a fight, she knew she wouldn't be his match. I'm just here to visit my life savior. Julian Quinn slowly turned around, gently laying Peter down and covering him with a thin blanket. After all, he was still a child, sleeping soundly without the vigilance of an adult. Life savior? Clara Blake was completely clueless about the story between the two of them. Hearing this now, she was quite surprised. How could Peter possibly become his life savior? Julian Quinn glanced at Peter again and spoke slowly. Ask him tomorrow. As for his illness, I already know the cause. The elixir you need, I'll lend you a hand. With that, Julian Quinn gave Clara Blake a deep look, turned, and stepped through the window. In just a few swift movements, he left the Marquis residence and vanished into the dark night. Clara Blake stood rooted to the spot, her thoughts in turmoil. Fragments of memories began piecing together like shards, forming a picture. Back then, she had been poisoned by the seductive toxin of the wicked Eleanor Reed and locked in a meditation chamber. Unexpectedly, a man suddenly barged in. The man seemed to be somewhat unusual as well. When the two met, it was like dry wood encountering fire, igniting fiercely. His eyes were exactly like the alluring eyes of Julian Quinn. Although she hadn't seen his face directly, there was a vague feeling that he might be the man who had a fateful encounter with Clara Blake 5 years ago. The news of the return of the William family's young lady quickly spread throughout the city. Over the past 5 years, the scandal had gradually faded from memory, but now it was brought up once more. Of course, when mentioning this scandal, one couldn't forget the people involved, such as Clara Blake's former fiancé, Charles Anderson. For the moment, a dark cloud loomed heavily over the second prince's residence once again. The most delighted individuals were William Blake and Eleanor Reed. This was exactly the outcome they desired. The more tarnished Clara Blake's reputation became, the less likely anyone would want to marry her. If no one married her, the Blake estate wouldn't need to explain anything to the fourth prince. Today, Henry Owen came to the William residence seeking an audience with Clara Blake. Coincidentally, Amelia Blake, who was preparing to attend a banquet, spotted him. Seeing Henry Owen dressed elegantly, exuding charm, and possessing a handsome face, she couldn't help but take a closer look. The servants mentioned that he was the second son of the prestigious Owens bloodline family. In the Vermilion Empire, noble families were few, and the Owens bloodline was considered immensely powerful and wealthy beyond imagination. Even members of the royal family would show them respect. This demonstrated just how influential they were within the Vermilion Empire. Upon learning that the Owens bloodline's young master had come to meet Clara Blake, Amelia immediately devised a plan. She stepped forward, pretending to be demure and virtuous, personally escorting Henry Owen to Anthor Hall. I'm quite curious, how did the young master of the Owens bloodline come to know my elder sister? Amelia Blake held a silk handkerchief over half her mouth, gazing at Henry Owen with eyes as sparkling as autumn waters. For an ordinary man, how could he resist such a lure? Unfortunately for her, this was Henry Owen. Henry Owen, who was constantly surrounded by countless beauties, was already far too familiar with such petty tricks from women. Clara Blake hasn't told you yet? She and I are like fated enemies bound to cross paths. Henry Owen couldn't help but smile. Every time he thought of Clara Blake and Peter storming the mountain camp, he couldn't stop himself from laughing. That domineering mother and son duo was truly cunning. Amelia Blake let out an awkward laugh, feeling deeply uncomfortable inside. Traveling with him all this way, she had never seen him laugh like that before. Now, just the mention of that vile woman made him smile so brightly. Since you're acquainted with my sister, then surely the young master of the Owens bloodline must know about her story as well. Amelia Blake spoke slowly, carefully observing Henry Owen's expression, only to see the smile on his face quickly disappear. His eyes filled with gloom as he said coldly, "It's improper for a younger sister to gossip about others behind their back." Amelia Blake slightly furrowed her brows, but the corners of her lips revealed a faint, indifferent smile. "So, he does care after all." "Humph, just a withered flower and fallen willow. Men like it only out of fleeting interest, merely captivated by the appearance for the moment. Amelia talks too much, thinking that the young master is her elder sister's friend. There are currently many rumors outside, making her elder sister very heartbroken. She originally wanted to ask the young master to comfort her elder sister on Amelia's behalf." Amelia Blake put on a small, aggrieved face, her eyes brimming with tears as she looked at Henry Owen, appearing very pitiful. Chapter 29, about to be deceived by her. Even a seasoned player in the field of romance like Henry Owen couldn't help but feel a twinge of compassion when faced with this delicate little face. Just as the two were walking toward the wall of Anshow Hall, Peter Blake, who was sunbathing on the wall, overheard their entire conversation. He immediately jumped down, landing beside Henry Owen, and sweetly called out, "Uncle of the Owens bloodline." Henry Owen's face lit up with a radiant smile the moment he saw Peter. "Peter, where is your mother?" Peter pointed toward the wall. "Mother is inside, having tea with great-grandmother." "Is there something wrong?" The little boy tilted his adorable head and asked with a playful grin. Henry Owen bent down to pick Peter up, gently tapping the boy's nose, and said with a laugh, "Today, the trading house is hosting an important auction. The spirit medicine family has brought a rare spiritual herb. I figured your mother might be interested, so I came to inform you." Hearing that he could go out to play, Peter was overjoyed. He had been cooped up at home for days and was bored to death. "That sounds great, but buying spiritual herbs costs a lot of money. Uncle, you know my mother and I just rejoined the family, we're dirt poor." Peter glanced at Henry Owen's expression, speaking so convincingly it almost seemed real. Henry Owen couldn't help but laugh helplessly. This little rascal was always so money-minded. Before Henry Owen could respond, Amelia Blake, who had been ignored this entire time, finally found an opportunity to interject. "Peter, dear, if you need money, Auntie will give it to you." "Why ask the Owens bloodline, Uncle?" Peter turned his head to glance at Amelia Blake coldly and said, "What's wrong with Auntie today? Yesterday, you said you wanted to kick me out of the house. Why are you being so nice to me now?" "Humph, Mother always said there's no need to be polite with two-faced people like her." Henry Owen's expression changed instantly, and his gaze toward Amelia Blake became filled with hostility. So, she had been acting this whole time? Was he about to be deceived by her? What a cunning woman! Amelia Blake was eager to explain but saw that Henry Owen didn't even spare her a glance. He simply carried Peter into Anshow Hall. She was so furious she stomped her feet, but there was nothing she could do. Anshow Hall was not like other places. Without the old matriarch's permission, no one could enter freely. When Clara Blake heard about the appearance of a spiritual herb, she naturally couldn't let it slip by. As an alchemist, her passion for spiritual herbs far exceeded that of ordinary people. It was still the VIP lounge on the second floor of Owen Trading. Beside him were Charles Anderson and the seventh Princess, Helen Anderson. When Clara Blake and Peter arrived together, Charles Anderson's calm eyes flickered slightly. After some consideration, he finally stood up and headed to Henry Owen's private VIP lounge. Clara Blake nodded perfunctorily to Charles Anderson and then turned away, paying him no further attention as she observed the crowd in the auction hall. Today was even more bustling than the day of the white blood herb auction, likely due to the presence of the spiritual medicine clan. A familiar figure appeared amidst the crowd, dressed in a deep green robe embroidered with water thread patterns, wearing a jade crown, with a suave demeanor. Who else could it be but her despicable father? And behind William Blake was another striking figure, Amelia Blake, the person who despised her like cats and dogs. This father-daughter duo had also come to participate in the auction. Could they be eyeing the spiritual medicine as well? As soon as Amelia Blake entered the hall, she began searching for Clara Blake. When her gaze swept over the VIP seats on the second floor, she spotted Clara Blake lounging lazily in a sandalwood chair, sipping tea. Beside her was Peter Blake, accompanied by two handsome men. Amelia recognized Henry Owen, but the other man had a noble aura and a cold expression. "Father, look at Clara Blake. She's at it again, flirting with men everywhere. Aren't you going to do something about it?" Amelia Blake tugged at William Blake's sleeve, pouting in displeasure. Her expression was full of irritation. What kind of sorcery had this woman used to make even Henry Owen personally invite her? William Blake followed his daughter's gaze and indeed saw Clara Blake seated in the VIP lounge. Beside Peter were Henry Owen and Charles Anderson. Pulling Amelia's hand back, he lowered his voice and said, "Don't point randomly. That's Henry Owen and the second prince. You can't afford to offend them." Though he held the title of Marquis, it was an empty honor without real power. In contrast, Henry Owen and the second prince were formidable figures, one a legitimate heir of a prestigious family, likely to inherit the position of patriarch, and the other a direct son of the emperor with a chance to ascend the throne. Both were not to be trifled with. But how did Clara Blake come to know them? Henry Owen was one thing, but Charles Anderson? Clara Blake had clearly humiliated him before. Did he not mind? In the VIP lounge on the third floor, a man wearing a mask sipped wine, his deep almond-shaped eyes exuding charm and radiance, an unparalleled presence. The auction began with some low-grade pills and martial skills, which did not stir much excitement in the hall and fetched unimpressive prices. However, when the auctioneer placed a sparkling crystal makeup box before the crowd, everyone's attention was immediately captivated. The box, adorned with 5 types of gemstones, emitted a mysterious glow, its breathtaking beauty leaving people in awe. Even Clara Blake, who rarely cared for jewelry, couldn't take her eyes off it. The auctioneer opened the box, revealing a pure white jade hairpin resembling snow. Most strikingly, the tip of the hairpin bore a vivid red hue, reminiscent of a red plum blossom in the snow. The craftsmanship was exquisite, and the entire hairpin radiated an extraordinary beauty. Legend has it that this was the ornament of the celestial maiden of the Moon Palace before she ascended to immortality. It is called the fairy hairpin and has a unique feature. As long as lovers hold it, the tip of the hairpin will emit a red glow. Hence, it is also known as the love-testing hairpin, the auctioneer said slowly. Amelia Blake gazed at the fairy hairpin, captivated. Just looking at it made her desire to possess it, and after hearing the auctioneer's introduction, she liked it even more. She quickly acted coyly toward William Blake, demanding the jade hairpin. William Blake felt a bit troubled. Coming here today was merely because he couldn't refuse Amelia's request. He had no interest in spiritual pills or other such items, and even less interest in women's trinkets. Most importantly, this item clearly appeared to be of immense value, and with his financial resources, it might be beyond his reach. Amelia Blake continued to whine persistently, and William Blake, unable to scold his daughter in front of everyone, reluctantly nodded in agreement. In his mind, he thought that if it wasn't overly expensive and within his acceptable range, he could buy it as part of her dowry in the future. Unexpectedly, the starting price announced by the auctioneer immediately made him abandon the idea and regret coming here today. The starting price is 100,000 silver taels, with a minimum increment of 1,000 taels per bid, the auctioneer announced, scanning the room to signal the start of bidding. Soon, people began bidding, with the price quickly rising from 110,000 taels to 35,000 taels, and it continued to climb. When the price reached 80,000 taels, the number of bidders decreased significantly, as it was evident many felt that a single hairpin wasn't worth such a high price. 100,000, Henry Owen suddenly raised his paddle and bid 100,000 taels. The auctioneer was initially overjoyed but then noticed the bidder was the second young master, nearly fainting in frustration. What kind of stunt was the second young master pulling this time? Was he here to cause trouble again? What are you standing there for? Hurry up and announce the sale. Henry Owen lazily glanced at the auctioneer and said indifferently. The auctioneer, fuming with anger, had no choice but to comply and prepared to declare the sale. But just at that moment, Charles Anderson suddenly raised his paddle. Chapter 30, You Did It on Purpose. 101,000 taels. Henry Owen clearly did not expect Charles Anderson to join the bidding. This girlish trinket was something he had never cared about. What was going on today? The auctioneer didn't bother with what Henry Owen was thinking. Taking advantage of Henry's momentary daze, they quickly raised the silver gavel, ready to finalize the deal. But then, the distinguished guest wearing a mask on the third floor suddenly raised their paddle. 110,000. The auctioneer was delighted and turned to Charles Anderson, gauging his reaction. Charles Anderson hesitated briefly before raising his paddle again. 120,000. Buying a hairpin for 120,000 taels was certainly a sky-high price. However, this didn't seem to be the time to debate whether it was worth it or not. This was also a matter of pride. How could a prince lose to an unknown nobody? The corners of the masked figure's lips curved into a faint smile as they raised their paddle once more. 150,000. Gasps echoed throughout the auction hall. The grand finale treasure of the day hadn't even appeared yet, and the bidding was already this intense. Charles Anderson gritted his teeth, the number card in his hand almost buried under the weight of his fury. Just as he was about to raise the paddle again, the seventh princess beside him hurriedly stepped forward, pressing his hand down firmly and whispering softly. Royal brother, do not act out of momentary anger. Charles Anderson, consumed by rage, suddenly regained his composure. His royal sister was right, he could not act impulsively, as it would be detrimental to the grand plan. The auctioneer, seeing that Charles Anderson had stopped bidding, regretfully announced the conclusion. The item was finally claimed by the distinguished guest with number 038 on the third floor. Clara Blake set down her teacup, stood, and walked toward the intricately carved railing. She raised her head to look at the third floor, where a man leaned casually against the railing, meeting her gaze. Those enchanting almond-shaped eyes, filled with a playful smile, it was indeed him, Julian Quinn. Peter followed Clara Blake's gaze and noticed a man wearing a mask looking at his mother. Though the man's face was hidden, those eyes, how could Peter ever forget them? Uncle Quinn? Peter raised his head and called out to Julian Quinn. Julian Quinn's gaze shifted to Peter, the amusement in his eyes deepening. This clever little boy had recognized him even with the mask on. "Mother, can I go to Uncle Quinn's side?" Peter asked Clara Blake. Clara Blake lowered her head, her brows slightly furrowed. "What are you doing?" "Uncle Quinn owes me 100,000 gold coins, I'm going to collect the debt." Peter grinned mischievously, resembling a money-loving kangaroo, entirely ignoring Clara Blake's annoyed expression. "Come back early." Clara Blake sat back in her original spot, reminding Peter. Henry Owen grabbed Peter's arm and hurriedly said, "Don't go," seeing him wearing a mask, "he's definitely not a good person. Let him go. If he dares to harm Peter, I will flatten his Sky Division Hall without hesitation." Clara Blake spoke nonchalantly. "The Heavenly Hall?" Henry Owen hastily let go of Peter, recalling how Peter addressed the other man as Uncle Quinn. Could it be that he is Julian Quinn? Charles Anderson was also secretly astonished. Julian Quinn had always been humble and avoided the spotlight, yet he was attending this auction? What could have piqued his interest? Was it merely this hairpin? Or perhaps the rare elixirs of the Elixir family? And how were Clara Blake and her child acquainted with Julian Quinn? Peter dashed away, and the auction hall once again erupted into a buzz. A faint medicinal fragrance wafted through the air, invigorating Clara Blake. She quickly raised her head and saw the auctioneer retrieving a jade box from an iron chest. Around the auction stage stood several elite guards, their expressions cold and alert, their eyes scanning the surroundings. Each had their hands firmly on the hilts of their swords, ready to strike at the first sign of trouble. The jade box was slowly opened, revealing the treasure inside, a pale green fruit, about the size of a newborn's fist, shaped like a small mythical beast, exuding a refreshing fragrance that lifted the spirit. Wasn't this the legendary Qilin fruit? The Qilin fruit was the miraculous remedy Clara Blake had long yearned for, one of the 5 missing ingredients for the blood transformation pill. She had visited the Elixir family numerous times but had never seen the Qilin fruit before. It must have been hidden in a secret location. The Elixir family truly lived up to its reputation, being able to cultivate such a nearly extinct divine medicine demonstrated their profound heritage and unparalleled expertise. The Qilin fruit is a treasure that every martial artist dreams of. The energy it contains is enough to elevate one's cultivation by 2 levels. What would normally take years of hard work for an ordinary person can be achieved with just 1 Qilin fruit. Who wouldn't go crazy over it? However, such fervor comes with a price to pay. Starting price, 10,000 gold taels. Each bid raises the price by 1,000 taels. Today, those attending the auction are all prominent figures, many of whom are extravagantly wealthy. The paddles are raised one after another, and the price quickly climbs to 70,000 gold taels. William Blake was truly astounded today. Before becoming a Marquis, he was just a concubine-born son, receiving only a dozen or so silver taels each month. Even after becoming a Marquis, his monthly stipend was merely 100 taels. His life of luxury was entirely thanks to his late wife. Yet, the luxury he once considered extravagant paled in comparison to the scene before him today. It was like comparing a shrimp to a whale. When the price surged to 100,000 gold taels, the number of bidders dwindled, leaving only a few in the VIP section. The common folk in the main hall had long since given up. 13,000. Charles Anderson raised his paddle, his gaze flickering toward Julian Quinn on the 3rd floor. Julian Quinn was engrossed in a conversation with Peter, paying no attention to the commotion of the auction. After Charles Anderson raised his paddle, no one dared to make a sound. Who didn't know he was the second prince? Once the second prince set his sights on something, who would dare compete? All eyes turned to Julian Quinn, anticipating a good show. Julian Quinn seemed uninterested in the Chilan fruit, engrossed in chatting with Peter, with no intention of raising his paddle. The auctioneer appeared disappointed, raising the gavel high, ready to bring the bidding to a close. 13,001. A clear, gentle voice, like a breeze, drifted from the VIP section. Though not loud, it skillfully caught everyone's attention. Amelia Blake exclaimed, "Father, Clara Blake just placed a bid. Is she crazy?" William Blake's hands trembled with anger. What was that girl thinking? 13,000 gold coins, did she think they were pebbles on the road? Even selling the entire Blake estate wouldn't amount to that much. Charles Anderson, however, was not surprised. Clara Blake was an alchemist, and naturally, she wouldn't pass up a miraculous item like the Chilan fruit. Moreover, high-ranking alchemists were often exceptionally wealthy. A mere 13,000 gold coins probably meant little to her. 14,000. Charles Anderson raised his paddle again. He was determined to obtain the Chilan fruit. At this moment, he was on the verge of breaking through from the 6th to the 7th rank and desperately needed the Chilan fruit's assistance. 140,001. Clara Blake remained indifferent, as if 140,000 gold coins were merely pocket change. Charles Anderson gritted his teeth, glaring at Clara Blake, and growled. 150,000. Clara Blake stayed calm as water. 150,001. She looked back at Charles Anderson, her eyes sparkling, the corners of her exquisite lips curving into a faint smile resembling cherry blossoms, half mocking, half disdainful. Charles Anderson was fuming, grinding his teeth in frustration. 160,000. 160,000, this was his limit, the maximum amount he could muster. Sure enough, Clara Blake calmly bid 160,001, leaving Charles Anderson so furious he felt like spitting blood. Helen Anderson, equally enraged, glared at Clara Blake and roared, "What's the meaning of this? You're doing this on purpose, aren't you?" Hashtag chapter 31, speak your mind, no need for violence. Clara Blake glanced at Helen Anderson and said calmly, "I'm simply buying what I want." What's wrong with that? Is there a rule against it in the auction house? Charles Anderson held back Helen Anderson, who was about to explode, and said to Clara Blake, "What exactly are you trying to do?" "Nothing much," Clara replied. "I just want the Chilan fruit." Clara Blake shrugged, her expression indifferent. "The Chilan fruit is very important to me. Consider it as repayment for saving my Peter, all right?" The woman in front of him was extremely annoying, yet he couldn't bring himself to hate her. Not because of her identity as an alchemist, but simply because she was a person, a woman. One matter is one matter. The Chilan fruit is also very important to me. She looked at Charles Anderson, seemingly pondering something, then added, "I can refine a bamboo sun pill for you as repayment, but the Chilan fruit, I must have it." Looking at her stunningly beautiful face and her unwavering, determined eyes, he felt his heart skip a beat. His gaze toward her began to feel unnatural. The auctioneer at the center of the hall, noticing the two engrossed in their conversation, raised his voice and said, "Miss Blake has bid 16,001. Is there anyone willing to bid higher?" The hall fell silent, and no one in the VIP section raised their paddle. Charles Anderson pondered for a moment. While the Qilin fruit was indeed exceptional, the bamboo sun pill was no ordinary elixir either. A single bamboo sun pill could help him break through his bottleneck without excessive cost. Wasn't this a profitable trade? Finally, Charles Anderson sat down, tossing the number card in his hand onto the table. The silver hammer in the auctioneer's hand fell once more, and Clara Blake ultimately emerged victorious, obtaining the rare spiritual medicine, the Qilin fruit. Surrounded by protective escorts, Sophia Lewis, the fourth young master of the spiritual medicine aristocratic family, personally carried a jade bottle to the VIP lounge to complete the transaction with Clara Blake. Sophia Lewis, at 23 years old, exuded an innate elegance and refined demeanor. "Miss Blake, it's been a while." Sophia Lewis's bright eyes fixed on Clara Blake, a smile dancing in the corners of his eyes and brows. Clara Blake also smiled, but her smile carried a hint of sarcasm. "Didn't we just meet last year?" Glancing at the jade bottle in his hand, she added, "It's only been half a year, and your Qilin tree has already borne fruit?" Sophia Lewis wasn't offended, only smiled gently and said, "This Qilin fruit isn't from the Lin Duok family. I happened to acquire it by chance." "Miss Blake, don't misunderstand." The moment he obtained the Qilin fruit, he had wanted to give it to Clara Blake. However, who would have thought she had already left the Lin Duok Valley and disappeared without a trace? Thus, he brought it to the largest auction house in the Vermilion Empire, certain that she would hear about it and come. Clara Blake pouted and said no more. Sophia Lewis was indeed generous to her, having gifted her many spiritual medicines for free. Moreover, his relationship with Peter wasn't bad, and he knew the Qilin fruit would be beneficial to Peter. If he had the Qilin fruit, there was no reason for him not to inform her. Clara Blake took out a stack of banknotes from her spatial ring, each worth 10,000 gold coins. She counted 16 notes and handed them to Sophia Lewis. "No change, just round it off." Sophia Lewis reached out to take them and smiled, "Whatever you say." He wasn't lacking in money, and neither was this elder sister of his. She didn't lack a single coin. Lady Clara Blake grabbed the Qilin fruit and swiftly tucked it into her spatial ring along with the remaining stack of banknotes. At that very moment, William Blake and Amelia Blake stormed into the VIP lounge, heading straight toward Clara Blake. Before William Blake could even steady himself, his hand was already raised high, aiming to slap Clara Blake across the face. Charles Anderson, who was seated at a small table about 3 meters away from Clara Blake, sipping tea, saw this and acted without hesitation. In a flash, he was by her side, firmly gripping William Blake's wrist and locking it in place. "Lord Blake, if there's an issue, let's discuss it calmly. Why resort to violence like this?" Charles Anderson's expression darkened. William Blake had not anticipated Charles Anderson would intervene so openly. The sharp pain in his wrist made his face twist as though he had bitten into a chili pepper. "Your Highness, she is my daughter. Is it wrong for me to discipline my own child?" Charles Anderson forcefully pushed William Blake's hand away and coldly said, "If you want to teach someone a lesson, do it at home. Don't make a fool of yourself in front of me." William Blake's face turned crimson and then faltered. Being born as a second son, he had always harbored feelings of inferiority. In front of someone as noble as Charles Anderson, whatever pride he had, completely deflated. Amelia Blake stood behind her father, eagerly anticipating the spectacle of Clara Blake being humiliated. However, to her surprise, several heroes came to Clara's rescue, and they were all influential figures. This left Amelia both envious and resentful. Henry Owen, a tactful businessman, quickly stepped in to mediate when he noticed the tension rising. The affairs of the Blake family are your private matters, and we outsiders have no place to interfere. However, I must say, my son Peter and Miss Blake get along quite well. I hope you won't make things difficult for them. William Blake's face grew even stiffer. Among the three men standing before him, there wasn't a single one he dared to offend. He let out an awkward laugh and stiffly replied, "You must be joking, young master of the Owens bloodline. Clara is my own daughter. How could I bear to make things difficult for her?" Internally, William Blake was seething with rage. Though he couldn't act now, once they returned to the manor, he was determined to teach that insolent girl a lesson she would never forget. With that thought, he turned to Sophia Lewis with a fawning smile. "Young Master Lin, I deeply apologize. My young daughter acted impulsively and purchased your spiritual medicine on a whim. However, 1.6 million gold taels is no small amount. I have always been upright and honest, and I truly do not have such a large sum. I hope young Master Lin will be generous and let this matter go." Sophia Lewis maintained her gentle and graceful demeanor, slightly nodding at William Blake as she slowly spoke. "The Chelan fruit has already been paid for by Miss Blake. The transaction is complete." "What does Marquis Blake mean by this? Are you intending to return the goods?" Charles Anderson snorted disdainfully. "Return the goods? I would be overjoyed if that were the case. Paid in full? Transaction complete? 1.6 million gold taels?" William Blake looked at Clara Blake in disbelief, unable to trust his own ears. Clara Blake glared at Charles Anderson, pouting, "Return the goods? How embarrassing." With that, she turned to Henry Owen and said, "Let's go, find Peter for me." Without a word, Henry Owen quickly slipped out of the VIP lounge and rushed straight to the third floor. William Blake was even more bewildered. What kind of spell had this girl cast on these people? One after another, why did everyone act so strangely? The young master of the illustrious Owens bloodline family was running errands for her? Peter quickly returned with Henry Owen, holding a stack of banknotes in his hand, his face beaming with joy. He paid no attention to anyone in the room, rushed over to Clara Blake, and raised the stack of banknotes as if showing off his spoils. "Mother, I've earned another 100,000 gold coins." Clara Blake remained calm, reached out to pat her black-haired son's head, and gently said, "Good boy, Peter. Keep it and buy yourself some candy." With that, the mother and son walked hand in hand out of the VIP lounge, leaving William Blake and his daughter dumbfounded. 100,000 gold coins, for candy? How much candy would that even buy? On their way back to the Marquis, Amelia Blake persistently demanded that William Blake confiscate Clara Blake's spatial ring as soon as they returned. She was convinced that the ring must contain an unimaginable fortune. Without Amelia Blake's reminder, William Blake had already been mulling over this idea the entire journey. Just the Chelan fruit and the 100,000 gold coins in Peter Blake's possession were enough to ensure a life of luxury for him. Upon arriving at the Blake estate, Amelia Blake immediately recounted everything to concubine Duong. The mother and daughter were overjoyed, jumping up and down as if the 100,000 gold coins were already piled up in front of them, ready for their indulgence. Chapter 32, Betrayal, Desertion in the face of battle. Before he could even take a sip of tea, William Blake stormed into a no hall with great fury. It was mealtime, and the old matron, Clara Blake, and Peter had just sat down at the dining table when William Blake barged in. "Clara, be honest. How do you know those three distinguished individuals?" In the past, he wouldn't have wasted words on her, just a slap across the face would have sufficed. But now things were different, those three were no ordinary people. He needed to figure out the situation before making any decisions. Clara Blake calmly placed a piece of tender white fish on Peter's plate and replied nonchalantly, "Nothing special, just got acquainted, that's all." William Blake sneered coldly. If it was truly nothing special and they weren't close, then she shouldn't blame him for being ruthless. He stepped up to Clara Blake and pointed at the spatial ring on her finger. "From now on, you're not allowed to go to the trading house anymore. Hand over the spatial ring to me for safekeeping." The old matron slammed her chopsticks onto the table, her face darkened with anger. "Shameless. After taking her dowry, now you're eyeing her assets too? Do you even know what shame is?" William Blake was fuming. It was bad enough to endure humiliation outside, but this was Blake Estate, his domain. How dare she speak so insolently to him? Did she still see him as the insignificant younger son he once was? "I kindly remind Mother to remember this, in Blake Estate, I am the master. Without my consent, you women have no right to speak." It was the first time William Blake had raised his voice at the old matron, making it clear that he intended to sever ties. But the old matron wasn't afraid of him. To her, the bond between them had long since withered. "Without me, don't even dream of sitting in the Marquis seat of Blake Estate. Ungrateful and shameless. Get out of my in-law hall." The old matron, furious, wanted nothing more than to throw him out of the house immediately. William Blake snorted coldly, ignoring the old matron's outburst. He turned to glare at Clara Blake. "As long as you obediently hand over the spatial ring and keep your mouth shut, you'll remain the esteemed young lady of this Marquis household." Clara Blake seemed entirely unaffected by the tense atmosphere. She continued peeling shrimp for her son, dipping the plump shrimp into a fragrant sauce before placing it into Peter's mouth. Slowly, she wiped her hands with a damp cloth, her red lips parting slightly. "And if I refuse?" A sinister glint flashed across William Blake's once handsome face. "If you refuse, don't blame a father for being ruthless." The corners of Clara Blake's lips, as beautiful as cherry blossoms, curled into a mocking smile. "Father has been ruthless to his daughter more than once. Why bother giving a warning now? If you have the skill, go ahead and show it." The old madam gestured to Madame Wang, who immediately understood and clapped her hands 3 times. Suddenly, 2 shadowy figures appeared beside William Blake like specters. Seeing this, William Blake burst out laughing and said, "You wretched old man, so you really did bring shadow guards into the manor." When Eleanor told me, I didn't believe her, but it seems she was right. "Too bad for you. If you can name your price, then I, William Blake, can certainly name mine." He turned to command the 2 shadow guards, "Tie up this wretched old man." The guards immediately obeyed, moving swiftly, causing the old madam to break out in a cold sweat. These shadow guards were clearly hired by her, how could they turn against her at the crucial moment? The guards moved with lightning speed, appearing behind the old madam in the blink of an eye. Both struck simultaneously, but Madame Wang threw herself in their way, only to be knocked to the ground by a single palm strike. Clara Blake's fingers twitched slightly, and 2 chopsticks from the dining table shot toward the 2 shadow guards. They dodged quickly, but to their shock, the chopsticks seemed to have eyes, turning mid-air and piercing straight into their chests. Blood sprayed everywhere, staining the entire room red. William Blake hadn't even seen how Clara Blake made her move before the two guards collapsed to the ground. You've been practicing martial arts?" William Blake stammered in disbelief, pointing at Clara Blake as if she'd betrayed him. "What? Is it so strange that I, Clara Blake, can practice martial arts? Does it shock you that much?" Clara Blake stared at William Blake, whose expression was a mix of astonishment and horror, as if he were looking at a monster. "You were clearly a useless wretch, without spiritual roots. How could you possibly practice martial arts? This is absolutely impossible." One of the main reasons William Blake despised Clara Blake so much was revealed. After the princess consort had passed away, he'd taken the 1-month-old Clara to the Spirit Root Hall to have her foundation tested. The result was that she was deemed a waste, which only deepened his dislike for her. The old madam looked at William Blake, her face free of blame but filled with resignation, and sighed, "You didn't even know about this? Your entire life has been ruined by Eleanor Reed. If the heavens bring calamity, one may still survive, but if one brings calamity upon oneself, there is no escape." At this moment, William Blake was startled. Eleanor Reed had a relative, the very person in charge of the Lingji Temple. Could it be that she had meddled in this? He didn't want to pursue past matters anymore, but now, with the arrow already on the bowstring, he had no choice but to release it. There was no turning back for him. He quickly drew a short sword from his sleeve, pale blue energy slowly emanating from his palm. "I'll ask one last time, are you going to hand over the spatial ring willingly or not?" Peter swallowed the shrimp in his mouth, raised his chubby little hand, and said to William Blake, "I also have a spatial ring, Grandpa. Do you want to take mine?" Only then did William Blake notice the ring on Peter's chubby hand. Sure enough, it was a spatial ring, with a coiled dragon design, a high-grade type comparable to the dragon pattern spatial ring on Clara Blake's hand. Looking at the ring on his own hand, though also a spatial ring, it was just a very ordinary snake-patterned one. Seeing the greed in William Blake's eyes, Clara Blake couldn't help but sneer coldly. "What's the matter? Father, are you even going to covet a child's belongings now?" William Blake said nothing more, realizing the other party would never hand it over willingly. He had no choice but to seize it by force. The pale blue energy from his palm surged, transforming the short sword in his hand into a long sword, which he thrust directly at Peter Blake's forehead. The teacup in Clara Blake's hand instantly turned to powder as killing intent surged on her face. "Well done, William Blake, how dare you act so ruthlessly, even openly attacking your own grandson." Though furious, Clara Blake did not make a move. With William Blake's abilities, he posed no real threat to Peter. The energy sword from William Blake moved toward Peter Blake, but the tip stopped half an inch from Peter's forehead. No matter how hard William Blake tried, he couldn't advance it any further. A familiar yet terrifying pressure enveloped him. The source of this pressure was none other than his own grandson. Peter Blake raised an eyebrow, his face showing a mischievous expression. "Grandpa, what's wrong? Why are you pointing a sword at Peter?" William Blake was in a miserable state now, unable to advance or retreat. The power within his body was continuously draining, and before long, he would collapse from exhaustion. "What kind of demonic technique have you practiced? Why is my energy being drained?" William Blake roared angrily, trying to stop the energy from flowing out, but to no avail. Peter blinked innocently and smiled sweetly. What is Grandpa talking about? Who's draining your energy? William Blake bellowed, "You little brat, stop pretending. Stop it now. Do you want to commit such an unfilial act?" Clara Blake snorted coldly, glanced at William Blake, and said icily, "You call yourself a grandfather, yet you point a sword at your own grandson. You won't even spare a child. Tell me, is there anyone in this world more heartless than you?" Hashtag chapter 33, What have you done to me? William Blake choked, momentarily at a loss for words to argue, and could only spit out hatefully, "Unless you kill me right now, otherwise, William Blake will never let this go." His eyes glinted with malice as he scrutinized the three people in front of him. He was certain that Clara Blake wouldn't dare to kill him. After all, he was a dignified noble of a Marquis household. If he were to die mysteriously, the court would undoubtedly intervene. No matter how formidable Clara Blake was, could she possibly stand against an entire nation? Clara Blake slowly stood up, her gaze icy as she stared at William Blake. She spoke each word deliberately, feeling proud. "Are you? Are you so sure I wouldn't dare to act?" "You're right, I don't intend to kill you. Killing you would be too easy. I'll let you live a long life in this world, watching as you lose everything, enduring a dark existence where you can never hold your head high again. Only then will it be worthy of my late mother and the suffering my son has endured all these years." William Blake felt his hair stand on end under her piercing stare. His legs trembled, and an unprecedented fear rose within him. The woman before him, with her cold demeanor and bloodthirsty smile at the corner of her lips, no, she wasn't Clara Blake. The Clara Blake he knew had been timid as a mouse since childhood, always hiding behind the old matriarch when trouble arose. When had she ever dared to speak to him like this? "Who are you? Who are you really? You're not Clara Blake. Why are you impersonating her?" William Blake stammered, his face filled with terror. Clara Blake lightly waved her sleeve, a silvery force shot out, striking directly at William Blake. William Blake only felt that the last trace of vital energy remaining in his body was completely stripped away. His right hand, which was holding the sword and pointing at Peter Blake's forehead, from the wrist upward, every bone shattered. He could only watch helplessly as his body, like a falling leaf, slammed against the wall. His entire right arm went limp and powerless, as if it no longer belonged to him. What have you done to me?" William Blake stared in horror at his arm. He couldn't even feel a trace of pain, nor the existence of his right arm. The vital energy in his body had vanished as if it had never been there. Scared? Hurt? Her beautiful eyes were filled with resentment. Because of him, Peter had to endure unimaginable suffering from the moment he was born. Because of him, she lived every day in constant fear, terrified of losing Peter. The game has only just begun. Just wait and see. At this moment, Madame Wang had regained consciousness. Seeing the scene before her, she was momentarily stunned. The old matriarch was both shocked and delighted, shocked at Clara Blake's drastic transformation, as if she had become a completely different person, and delighted that Clara Blake now had the ability to protect herself. She no longer had to worry about Clara being bullied. "Madame Wang, please escort the master back to his room." Clara Blake didn't spare William Blake another glance. She turned and sat back beside Peter, continuing to peel shrimp for him. Madame Wang obeyed, hurriedly helping the trembling William Blake, whose legs could hardly support him, out of an show hall. Outside the door, Eleanor Reed and Amelia Blake had been waiting for a long time. The mother and daughter were beaming with joy, thinking that the master must have obtained the spatial ring by now. Imagining the 10,000 taels of gold and their impending luxurious life, they couldn't contain their excitement. Waiting and waiting, they finally witnessed William Blake reduced to a cripple. They ultimately understood that Clara Blake was no longer the little weakling she once was. She had turned into a fierce tiger that devoured anyone in her way. Seeing William Blake's miserable state, Eleanor Reed began contemplating leaving. If Clara could be so ruthless even to her own father, what chance did she stand? Previously, Eleanor had been arrogant, relying solely on William Blake's power. Now that he had fallen, she was nothing more than an ant, easily crushed by Clara Blake at any moment. While Eleanor Reed was secretly packing her belongings, preparing to flee the Marquis' residence with her children, she suddenly realized her precious son had vanished. As the mother and son duo were discussing sending someone to search for him, a servant rushed in, panicked, reporting that the mansion gates had been blocked. The young master had been tied up like a dumpling and thrown unceremoniously outside. The mother and son hurriedly ran to the gate, only to see the boy beaten black and blue, his face swollen, clothes tattered, covered in blood, with whip marks clearly visible. Seeing his mother and sister, the boy frantically cried out for help. "Are you the mother of this brat?" A burly, bearded man turned to Eleanor Reed, who was trembling with rage, and asked. Eleanor Reed rushed to embrace her son, trembling as she untied him, screaming, "Who are you people? How dare you assault someone in broad daylight? Do you even know where you are? I'll have all of you thrown into prison." The bearded man laughed loudly. "Go ahead, throw me in prison if you can. But before that, you'd better pay me back the money your son owes me. Otherwise, I'll take his life right here and now." "You're lying. How could my son owe you money? Don't try to deceive me. Someone, go report this to the authorities." Eleanor Reed held her son tightly, seeing blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. She was speechless, her heart aching as if it were being torn apart. The bearded man snorted, pulling out a piece of paper from his chest. On it were the clear words, "Debt agreement," along with her son's signature and fingerprint. When her eyes fell on the amount, 3,000 gold taels, Eleanor Reed's vision darkened, and she nearly fainted. 3,000 gold taels were her entire fortune, painstakingly saved over years by selling off bits of Clara Blake's dowry. "I don't believe it. Why would my son borrow money from you? You must have tricked him." Eleanor Reed protested, her face flushed with anger, her heart burning with anxiety. These people clearly weren't ones to mess with. Now that the Marquis was bedridden, the old matron refused to help, and her own family offered no support. How could she possibly fight them alone? The bearded man sneered again. "I, Benjamin Carter, may love money, but I do honest business. Your son lost at my gambling house and borrowed 3,000 gold taels. Many people can testify to this. Even if we go to court, I have the evidence. As the ancients say, a debt must be repaid. If he can't pay, he'll have to give his life in return. I, Benjamin Carter, live as a man of honor. If you try to default, even if I end up in prison, I'll take his life. Think carefully." Eleanor Reed felt her world spinning. If she didn't pay, her son would lose his life. But if she paid, how could she survive? Seeing Eleanor Reed frozen in place, Benjamin Carter drew a dagger from his belt and slowly stepped toward her. "I don't have time to waste on you. If you won't pay, then leave his life here." With those words, he raised the dagger, the blade aimed directly at the young boy's chest. Eleanor Reed screamed in terror. Stop! Don't kill him! I'll pay, all right? She held her son tightly, refusing to let Benjamin Carter harm him. Amelia Blake collapsed to the ground. She knew they were doomed, truly doomed. Eleanor Reed spent all her money to ransom her child, leaving herself penniless. Seeing her son covered in injuries, her heart ached as if it were being pierced by knives. How could they be so cruel to her precious boy? He was only 14, still just a child. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. The more she thought, the more she felt this matter was undoubtedly connected to Clara Blake. Finally, she stormed straight into the Owenduong. There, she saw Clara Blake chatting animatedly with the elderly woman. On the table lay a small stack of banknotes and a pile of land deeds, properties, and store ownerships, everything Clara Blake had amassed from the Blake estate over the years. Now, all of it was neatly placed in front of her. Chapter 34, The Fulfillment of Malicious Resentment. The woman charged forward, pointing at Clara Blake and shouting, "So it was you. I knew it couldn't be a coincidence. You've been scheming behind our backs all along. I'm going to report this to the authorities." Clara Blake lazily raised her eyes to glance at her, replying calmly, "Go ahead. Your son borrowed money and now has to repay it. Do you think you have a case to report? This was all your plot to frame us. It has nothing to do with my son." Eleanor Reed raised her head and roared, her face flushed red with anger. "Speak with evidence, or I'll sue you for slander." Clara Blake remained calm and composed, as if discussing someone else's affairs, which only made Eleanor Reed grind her teeth in fury. Eleanor Reed trembled as she pointed at the stack of banknotes on the table, shouting, "Here! These are the evidence. I clearly gave them to Benjamin Carter, so why are they in your hands? And you still claim this has nothing to do with you?" Clara Blake coldly gazed at Eleanor Reed, her eyes filled with mockery. "Yours? What proof do you have that they're yours? You're merely a lowly concubine with a monthly allowance of 10 taels of silver. After expenses, what do you have left? Do you even have a generous dowry? These shops, these estates, where did you get them from?" Eleanor Reed staggered, almost falling, her vision darkened. She had nearly forgotten her own status. Sold by her parents into the royal household as a servant since childhood, she later followed Linda Anderson to marry into the Blake estate as a maid. Even with William Blake's favor, she was still just a concubine. Without her natal family's support or financial resources, how could she have acquired such wealth if not by spending Linda Anderson's dowry? She gritted her teeth, lifting her head to glare at Clara Blake, her eyes brimming with malicious resentment. "Fine, let's not talk about these for now. But why did you target my 14-year-old son? What crime has he committed? How could you be so heartless?" Every time she thought of her son's wounds, his body covered in blood, her heart ached unbearably. Clara Blake closed her eyes, slowly stood up, and walked toward Eleanor Reed. Meeting her resentful gaze, she spoke coldly. "Your son is human, but does that mean the children of others are not human? You feel heartbroken when your son gets hit a few times, yet you had the heart to order the destruction of a 14-year-old girl's purity. How could you be so cruel?" Eleanor Reed stepped back a few paces, horrified as she looked at Clara Blake. So, she knew. She knew everything. Was she back this time for revenge? What's wrong? Lost for words? Don't be afraid. This is only the beginning. The suffering in your lives is far from over. I will show you what true karmic retribution looks like. Clara Blake coldly stared at Eleanor Reed, this cruel woman. Killing her would be as easy as flipping a hand, yet Clara deliberately spared her life, so she could witness her own children step by step descend into an inescapable abyss. It was all me. If you want to kill or punish someone, deal with me. My son and daughter know nothing of this. Please, spare them. Eleanor Reed thought of William Blake's fate and realized that no matter what, she couldn't win against Clara. She decided it was better to plead for mercy, hoping for even a sliver of hope. Clara Blake coldly gazed at Eleanor's ever-changing expressions. Did Eleanor think everyone in this world was as foolish as William Blake? That they would believe her lies? Did she really expect Clara to think of her as a loving mother? Even if she were truly a loving mother, what did that have to do with Clara? Clara kicked Eleanor Reed, who was clutching her legs, aside and calmly said, I ask myself, what have I done wrong? Yet you have schemed against me time and time again. What now? Your children are human, and I am not. Seeing Clara's icy demeanor, Eleanor Reed realized that begging was futile. She decided to try another approach, stood up with a heavy heart, wiped her tears, and quietly left in the hall. Witnessing the scene, Madame Blake opened her mouth, then closed it again, unable to utter a word. She knew she too had wronged Clara Blake and had no right to plead for forgiveness for the descendants of Blake estate. Now, the entire Blake estate survived solely on the meager 100 taels of silver from William Blake's government stipend. Most of the servants had already left, except for a few bonded ones, and those who remained worked sluggishly, as they hadn't been paid in months. And though Hall seemed entirely unaffected by the financial storm wreaking havoc on Blake estate, continuing its indulgent lifestyle as usual. This left William Blake and Eleanor Reed agonizing day and night, unable to do anything about it. What? Say that again, clearly. Charles Anderson slammed the table and stood up abruptly, his eyes wide as he stared at the man in front of him. The man shrank back and recounted, this is absolutely true. 5 years ago, it was one of the aunts from Blake estate who gave old Wu 100 taels of silver, instructing him to go to a brothel to buy an aphrodisiac. Then, they hired a pockmarked man to ambush outside the Great Qing Temple on the 15th day of the 5th month. The Mid-Autumn Festival? Charles Anderson furrowed his brow. 5 years ago, on the exact day of the Mid-Autumn Festival, Clara Blake was caught red-handed. Rumor had it there wasn't a single man in the room, only Clara Blake lying unconscious and completely bare. It seemed she had indeed been framed. With a loud crash, the mahogany table beside him shattered into dust under his furious palm strike. His face twisted, teeth clenched tightly as he spat out, well done, William Blake. You've got yourself quite a wife. Knowing full well she was my fiancé, Charles Anderson's fiancé, yet you dared to play tricks and put a crown of horns on this king's head. Excellent, truly excellent. Not long after, the court officials submitted a joint petition accusing William Blake of numerous crimes, each charge laid out clearly. Even the fourth prince stopped defending him and requested a leave of absence from court. The emperor flew into a rage, immediately issuing a decree to strip William Blake of his title and confiscate the Blake estate. This outcome was beyond the expectations of the Blake matriarch. She had initially planned to dethrone William Blake from his position as Marquis and select another heir from the Blake estate. Who would have thought things would spiral to such a disastrous end? The matriarch, however, had long been prepared. She had already purchased a house in the outskirts of the capital, complete with servants and maids. When the imperial decree was announced, she remained relatively composed. William Blake and his family slumped to the ground, unable to rise for a long time. The iron rice bowl that sustained their livelihood was gone. How were they supposed to survive now? That night, Eleanor Reed, clutching her last jewelry box, gathered her children and quietly fled the Blake estate, leaving the crippled William Blake to fend for himself. Only then did William Blake truly comprehend the difference between a first wife and a concubine. If Linda Anderson were still alive, as his lawful wife, she would never have abandoned him like Eleanor Reed did. Thinking further, if Linda Anderson were alive, he surely wouldn't have fallen into such a dire predicament. Alas, in this world, there is no medicine for regret. The rise and fall of the Blake estate, its prosperity and its ruin, were all because of women. The day the mansion was sealed, Clara Blake declined the old madam's kind offer and took Peter onto the carriage of the fourth prince's residence. The fourth prince's residence hosted a peony banquet, purchasing all the renowned peonies in the city to decorate the garden where the banquet was held. Every child of officials ranked fourth or above in the capital, as long as they were unmarried, received an invitation from the fourth prince's residence. The invitation merely stated it was to find companions for the young masters and ladies in the residence, but everyone understood the real purpose. It was simply an excuse by the fourth prince, who, in truth, was seeking a husband for his illegitimate granddaughter. Though no one truly wanted to marry such a woman, human curiosity is a peculiar thing. By dusk, the gates of the fourth prince's residence were bustling. Carriages lined the streets, and people crowded in. While they had no intention of marrying Clara Blake, they were eager to see what this woman with an illegitimate child looked like. Immediately, the young masters and ladies in the garden of the prince's residence scattered like bees from a broken hive, buzzing about everywhere. #### Chapter 35, What Makes the Best Dad? The fourth prince raised his wine cup, laughing heartily with delight. It had been years since the royal residence had been this lively. With so many young gentlemen gathered, surely one or two would catch the eye of his precious little Clara. "Wait, isn't that the second prince?" a feminine voice exclaimed, her small, delicate hand covering her mouth as her wide eyes reflected her surprise. "Why is he here?" Clara Blake was his former fiancée, and she even gave him a long, humiliating betrayal. Could he have come to settle the score with Clara Blake? And the man behind him, isn't that the young master from the Owens bloodline family? Why would he be here too? Looking at the way the second prince is speaking with the fourth prince, it doesn't seem like he's here for revenge. Could it be he's forgotten what happened 5 years ago? Forgotten or not, what does it matter? You girls only focus on the surface and know nothing of the deeper truths. The fourth prince, despite his age, holds an incredibly significant position in the court. While he doesn't have a legitimate son, his secondary sons are all remarkably talented. Whether it's the crown prince or the second prince, the fourth prince is someone they both aim to win over. A mere scandal involving a woman, do you think men with grand ambitions like them would waste time fretting over such trivialities? A composed young lady spoke slowly, her tone carrying an air of authority as though she understood the intricacies of court politics. She cast a disdainful glance at the other noble ladies, silently thinking how foolish and ignorant they all were. The young ladies nodded repeatedly. The girl before them was none other than the eldest daughter of the Prime Minister's household, Emma Schwer. Known for her arrogance and high standards, she often relied on her father's influence in the court to mock them. They could only harbor resentment silently without daring to speak up. "Who is that over there?" He's so handsome, I don't think I've ever seen him before, a young lady in a pink dress exclaimed, staring intently at the man in white approaching from afar. Schwer followed the direction of her gaze. As the man in white looked over, her heart seemed to leap out of her chest. His elegant features were as refined as jade, his demeanor cold and distant, and his deep, alluring eyes captivated anyone who looked into them. As he gradually approached, she felt her breath hitch, unable to take her eyes off his face. That's Julian, the eldest legitimate son of Prince Juan. It's said he rarely goes out and dislikes attending events like this. I saw him once at a royal banquet 3 years ago. He was truly extraordinary. Another young lady shared what she knew, her face revealing undisguised admiration. He is indeed handsome, but it's a pity he has a stepmother as fierce as a tiger. Prince Juan is chronically ill and bedridden most of the year. With a stepmother who has her own son, who knows if the title of prince will even belong to him in the future, another young lady remarked regretfully, seemingly lamenting Julian's circumstances. What do you know? In our country, the inheritance of the title is based on legitimate succession. Julian is both the eldest and the legitimate heir, why wouldn't he inherit the title? Schwer retorted, blushing as she scolded the girl who had spoken. The group of young ladies stuck out their tongues, not daring to argue further. By the time they looked again, Julian had already disappeared. In one of the rooms in the rear courtyard of the prince's residence, Clara Blake changed into a new outfit her grandfather had made for her. Knowing her preferences, he had specially chosen a piece of western silk brocade. The collar and sleeves were embroidered with red plum blossoms, paired with a belt adorned with rubies, accentuating her graceful figure. "Mother, you look so beautiful." Peter tilted his head, watching his mother apply makeup. He then asked, "Mother, is Uncle Quinn really not my father?" The hand applying makeup paused, thinking of Julian Quinn's sky-splitter palace and his masked face. A man like that must surely hide countless unspeakable secrets. Someone who has to live behind a mask is too dark and mysterious. Even if he were Peter's biological father, she absolutely could not let Peter acknowledge him. Smiling softly, she set down the eyebrow brush, embraced her son, and gently said, "Peter, don't worry. Mother will definitely find you the most wonderful father in the world, all right?" "What is the most wonderful father like?" Peter asked curiously, eager to meet this so-called perfect father. Clara Blake thought hard, trying to paint a picture of what the most wonderful would be. At the very least, he must have money, lots of money. He must also be handsome so you won't feel embarrassed. And he must protect both Mother and Peter. Otherwise, what use would he be? I can't think of anything else for now. I'll add more when I do. A flash of white appeared at the door, and an attractive smile curled on his lips. Must have money, must be handsome, must be skilled in martial arts. It seemed he met all the criteria. Clara Blake had just finished dressing Peter in new clothes when a maid's voice came from outside. "Miss Lamb, the prince invites you to the rear garden." "I understand. Please inform the prince that I will be there shortly," Clara Blake replied. She gently adjusted Peter's outfit, tying his shoulder-length hair neatly. Looking at her adorable, jade-like son, her smile was as sweet as honey. "Mother, why does grandfather invite so many strangers to the mansion to play?" Peter held Clara Blake's hand tightly, his face slightly displeased as he gazed at the bustling crowd in the distance. "Grandfather is afraid that Mother and Peter will feel lonely, so he invites many people to make the house lively. If Peter doesn't like it, Mother will tell grandfather not to do it anymore in the future, alright? Clara Blake slightly furrowed her brows. She wasn't fond of situations like this, but since it was her grandfather's goodwill, she found it hard to refuse. Mother, look. Uncle from the Owens bloodline and Uncle Anderson are here too. Look over there. Peter pointed toward the two men standing beside the fourth prince. His earlier displeased expression faded, finally spotting familiar faces, making this gathering a little less dull. Clara Blake softly acknowledged with a hum. Their presence didn't surprise her. With her status as an alchemist, a prince, and a young master from a noble family showing up to curry favor was nothing unusual. Charles Anderson, engaged in conversation with the fourth prince, discreetly scanned the surroundings, searching for Clara Blake. It had been months since their last meeting at Owen Trading, yet her image lingered vividly in his mind. Though Clara Blake was undeniably beautiful, Charles Anderson was not someone easily swayed by appearance. Why, then, could he not forget the woman whom society labeled as fallen and ruined? Today, he came to the fourth prince's residence intending to see her again, hoping to sort out his thoughts and find a reason to detest her. However, when Clara Blake finally appeared before him, he realized he could no longer find any reason to dislike her. The sight of her walking hand in hand with Peter Blake was breathtaking, so surreal it felt as if they were celestial beings descending from the heavens rather than mere mortals. Her smile had the power to sway his emotions. Though he knew he shouldn't, his heart refused to obey his will. Perhaps it was time to reconsider his engagement with Clara Blake. Could the severed bond between them be mended? Clara Blake, you look stunning today, Henry Owen praised sincerely. He had encountered women far more beautiful than Clara Blake, but none possessed her unique aura. The subtle dominance exuding from her refined features elevated her beauty, making her appear regal and commanding respect. Clara Blake nodded politely at Henry Owen. She was genuinely grateful to him, for he had once helped her earnestly without any ulterior motives. Hashtag chapter 36, who exactly are you? Uncle Owen's bloodline, didn't you see Peter? Peter pouted, his almond-shaped eyes glaring at Henry Owen. He despised men who looked at his mother that way. Had they never seen a beautiful woman before? Henry Owen scratched his head and chuckled awkwardly. How could I not see? Peter is so adorable, it's hard to miss him. The fourth prince took the opportunity to lead Clara Blake around to greet everyone. The young noblemen, upon seeing such a beauty, couldn't help but feel their hearts flutter. But to take her as a wife? Absolutely not. As a concubine? Impossible, she was the niece of the fourth prince. Clara, come here and meet the heir apparent, the fourth prince called. Clara Blake downed her glass of wine, sighed, and turned around. A faint smile appeared on her indifferent face as she slowly walked over to the fourth prince. The man before her wore an elegant white robe, a jet-black jade pendant hung at his side, and his sleeves were embroidered with green bamboo branches, straight and refined like his posture. His phoenix eyes curved into a smile, and her heart trembled. Those eyes, they were unmistakably his. Miss Blake and I have met before, fourth prince. No need for introductions, Julian said with a small smile, his gaze never leaving her, his demeanor utterly composed. The fourth prince, hearing that the two were acquainted, laughed heartily and left. Are you Julian Quinn, or just Julian? As soon as the fourth prince walked away, Clara Blake's smile vanished. She glared at Julian with suspicion. I am Julian. And I am also Julian Quinn. Why? Surprised? Julian Quinn gave a faint smile. With just one glance, he captivated a group of young ladies, while the women on the other side gritted their teeth, glaring daggers at Clara Blake. How dare a faded flower like her openly seduce their idol? Clara Blake scoffed coldly, shooting Julian Quinn a sharp look. I don't care who you are. I'm warning you, stay away from me and my child, or don't blame me for being ruthless. Julian Quinn raised his glass toward Clara Blake, smiling gently. I only do what I like. I never bow to anyone's threats. The way is incompatible, no cooperation is possible. Clara Blake glared, turned around, and walked away. Julian Quinn downed his glass of wine, watching Clara Blake's silhouette fade into the distance. He recalled Peter's warm smile, and a thought in his mind became increasingly clear. Henry Owen kept his gaze fixed on Clara Blake, entirely oblivious to the dagger-like stare directed at him. Helen Anderson clenched her teeth in hatred, opened a packet of white powder, and poured it into a glass of wine, colorless, odorless. She swirled the glass gently, then slowly approached Henry Owen, giving him a firm pat on the shoulder. Henry Owen, what are you staring at? Henry Owen jolted, turning back to see Helen Anderson. Irritated, he snapped, Hey, can't you speak properly? You're a princess, yet you act like a man all the time. You have no grace at all. Helen Anderson wanted to retort badly, her left hand hidden in her sleeve clenched tightly, her knuckles turning white. Usually, she wouldn't just argue back but would also beat him up. However, today, glancing at the glass of wine, she smiled. Brother Henry, I was wrong, okay? Here, drink this to cool off. Henry Owen found Helen Anderson's unusual obedience suspicious. This was unprecedented, and it made him wary. What scheme was this girl plotting now? But he was thirsty, so he took the glass and drank it all. Before long, Henry Owen felt dizzy. He shook his head, trying to stay awake, but eventually collapsed unconscious. Helen Anderson waved her hand, and two strong maids emerged from the shadows, carrying Henry Owen away. As the banquet ended, Charles Anderson didn't immediately return to his residence. Waiting until everyone had dispersed, he approached the fatigued fourth prince. Your Highness. The fourth prince looked at Charles Anderson in confusion, unsure of his intentions. What is it, Charles? Charles Anderson glanced around. The servants were cleaning up, and there were many ears around. May I borrow a moment of your time, fourth uncle? The fourth prince nodded and led him to the front hall. Once the servants had served tea and snacks and left, Charles Anderson finally spoke, his face slightly flushed. Fourth uncle, the Blake estate has declined. Regarding Miss Clara, as you are her guardian, I am here today to propose marriage. I humbly ask you to grant Miss Clara's hand to me. The fourth prince's drowsiness vanished. He widened his eyes at Charles Anderson. Does your father and mother know about this? A woman who already has a child, how could the royal family possibly accept this? Moreover, he is a prince and a potential heir to the throne, this matter is absolutely impossible. Not yet, I want to get the consent of my royal uncle first, Charles Anderson cautiously observed the expression of the fourth prince, feeling uneasy inside. The fourth prince shook his head, my dear nephew, let's not talk about other matters, but as for your marriage, it's not up to you to decide. You know that your father has long promised the Prime Minister's daughter to you. As for Clara, I'm afraid it's out of the question. Charles Anderson shook his head, Uncle, you're overthinking. While I cannot decide on my main wife, I can still make decisions regarding a concubine. A concubine? The fourth prince immediately shook his head. No, absolutely not. Clara once told me that if she were to marry, it must be to someone who is wholeheartedly devoted to her, and she would never accept being a concubine. Let alone being a secondary wife? This is absolutely impossible. Charles Anderson widened his eyes in disbelief. Clara Blake must be insane. Just a fallen flower with some beauty, and she dares to demand monogamy? Ridiculous. Allowing her to be a concubine was already a great honor. Refusing to give up, Charles Anderson thought for a moment. Royal uncle, just speak to her first. Tomorrow, I will send someone to hear her reply, all right? The fourth prince reluctantly nodded. After sending Charles Anderson away, he immediately went to Clara Blake's small courtyard and relayed Charles Anderson's intentions. Clara Blake was both amused and annoyed. What kind of trick was Charles Anderson trying to pull? He wanted to marry her? Did he forget about being cuckolded? Grandfather, tomorrow you can tell him that I don't care for the position of a concubine and that he should abandon the idea. Clara Blake firmly refused, which also reassured the fourth prince. The crown prince and the second prince would undoubtedly fight over the throne in the future, with no room for compromise. The fourth prince didn't want Clara Blake to be dragged into it. Late at night, after coaxing Peter to sleep, she entered the bathroom to wash. The water was lukewarm, and she sank into it, finally allowing her body and mind to relax. Although the Duke's residence was grand and luxurious, it came with many rules and formalities that she disliked. Just a few days there had already left her feeling exhausted. If it weren't for her desire to fulfill her filial duty to the late Clara Blake, she would never have set foot in the Duke's residence. Reflecting on the year, 3 months had already passed, yet 5 ingredients for refining the blood elixir were still missing. She had spent 4 years gathering 10 medicinal ingredients but had only managed to collect 5. Now, with just 9 months left, could she possibly gather the remaining rare herbs in time? The moment she began to relax, the tension crept back in. Every time she thought of Peter's pained face, her heart ached deeply. She wished she could endure all his suffering in his place. What crime had her child committed to deserve such torment? Hashtag chapter 37, Scoundrel, let me go. Suddenly, a faint noise caught her attention. She quickly leaped out of the water, grabbed a thin silk robe nearby, and draped it over herself before rushing out of the bathroom. The room was dimly lit by a single lantern, casting an ethereal glow. A man dressed in white stood silently by the bed, gazing tenderly at the sleeping Peter. Hearing her footsteps, he turned to look at Clara Blake. Her jet-black hair cascaded down, still dripping with water. Her stunningly beautiful face bore an expression of surprise, and her alabaster neck gleamed against her dark hair. Her slender, graceful figure was barely covered by the thin silk robe, revealing tantalizing curves beneath. He swallowed hard, his voice hoarse as he said, "If it were someone else who came, would you greet them in this state too?" This state? Clara Blake looked down at herself, inspecting what he meant by this state. Under the thin, fragile silk, her curvaceous figure was vividly revealed. Her face flushed red as she hastily covered her chest with her hands and looked up at him, saying, "I believe I made myself very clear. I hope you won't appear again." Julian Quinn turned around, shrugged, and smiled. "I believe I was even clearer. I only do what I want and refuse to be threatened by anyone." Clara Blake was speechless, glaring at Julian Quinn, yet feeling utterly powerless. After all the years in this world, it was the first time she felt so helpless. The man before her, in terms of strength, surpassed her by more than a little. In terms of status, he was the heir apparent, and in terms of their relationship, he was Peter's biological father. Julian Quinn noticed her expression shifting continuously, her face growing more unpleasant, and her breathing increasingly uneven. Her slightly loose collar opened wider. He felt a heat rising in his lower abdomen, his breathing gradually becoming labored. He quickly turned his face away, not daring to look at her further, afraid he might lose control and pounce on her. Clara Blake, seeing him suddenly turn around, thought he might once again try to take Peter like before. She hurriedly ran over, grabbed Julian Quinn's arm, and whispered sharply, "What are you trying to do?" Julian Quinn had practiced martial arts for many years, naturally developing the instincts of a martial artist. When Clara Blake suddenly attacked him from behind, the energy within his body instinctively reacted, pushing her away. Caught off guard, Clara stumbled backward. Seeing this, Julian quickly reached out to catch her. Her slender, soft body fell into his embrace, and a faint, delicate fragrance wafted into his nose, intensifying the heat coursing through him. Falling into his strong, broad arms, Clara's heart skipped a beat, and her face flushed an even deeper red. She wanted to push him away, but felt as though she was trying to move an unyielding wall of steel. Against her waist, something firm pressed tightly against her. Not wanting to wake Peter, who was asleep nearby, she merely wriggled in an attempt to free herself. Julian took a deep breath, holding her even tighter, his voice hoarse, "Don't move, or I can't guarantee what might happen next." Clara froze, feeling the hard object against her waist grow even more solid and burning hot. Suddenly realizing what it was, her face turned crimson as if on fire. Biting her lip, she scolded through gritted teeth, "You scoundrel, let go of me now." Looking at her flushed face, Julian's body tensed even more. His mind told him to release her, but his hands and heart refused to obey. Holding her close brought an inexplicable sense of satisfaction that he couldn't resist. Overwhelmed with embarrassment, Clara bit down on his shoulder, only letting go when she tasted the metallic tang of blood. She looked up at him in disbelief. Didn't he feel any pain? Julian frowned slightly, letting out a bitter chuckle. "You truly are a ruthless woman. Even your own husband, you dare to bite. Aren't you afraid I'll divorce you?" Clara Blake felt his arm loosen slightly, and she quickly slipped out of his embrace, angrily saying, "What nonsense are you talking about?" Julian Quinn glanced at the blood-stained white robe and chuckled, "Whether you admit it or not, there are some truths you cannot escape." He looked at Clara Blake with a smile, then turned to Peter with a gentle expression. His hand lightly lifted, and a square sandalwood box appeared in his grasp. He placed the box on the dressing table and said, "This is a gift for Peter. Take good care of it. If anything happens, come to the Celestial Hall to find me. Whatever it is, as long as I can do it, I will help you." With that, he brushed off his sleeves and turned to leave. Clara Blake stood dazed in place. This man had clearly taken liberties with her, yet she let it go just like that. Moreover, she didn't feel the slightest bit of disgust in her heart. What was wrong with her? Opening the sandalwood box on the dressing table, she found 3 smaller boxes inside, 2 long ones made of white jade and 1 makeup box crafted from glass. The body of the makeup box was adorned with multicolored gemstones, which under the dim light emitted a mysterious and dazzling glow, extraordinarily beautiful. This was clearly the item auctioned at Owen Trading that day, indeed purchased by Julian Quinn. Why would he gift it to her? Inside the 2 long boxes were 2 rare medicinal herbs, 2 of the 10 herbs she had been painstakingly searching for to refine the blood elixir. After months of his absence, could it be that he had been searching for medicinal herbs for Peter? The next morning, a piercing scream echoed above the Duke's mansion. It was none other than Henry Owen. Waking up, he found himself lying naked on someone else's bed. More importantly, beside him lay a woman he had been trying to avoid at all costs. What had happened? He clearly remembered drinking Helen Anderson's wine last night. Afterward, he vaguely recalled being helped into a room. In his haze, he seemed to see Clara Blake leaning into his arms, and then he lifted the blanket and saw a bright red bloodstain on the bedsheet. It was over. He was done for. Helen Anderson's lips curled into a triumphant smile. Henry Owen, for the rest of your life, don't even dream of escaping me, humph. She had always stayed by his side, waiting for him to fall for her. But instead, he foolishly looked at another woman. To lure him into committing this act, she did not hesitate to drug him and even disguised herself as Clara Blake to make it happen. Thinking about how she, a dignified princess, had gone to such lengths for him, if he dared to betray her, she would make sure he had no descendants. Early in the morning, men sent by Charles Anderson were already waiting outside the royal residence. The 4th prince, claiming to be unwell, only sent a letter. His subordinate presented the letter to Charles Anderson, who, upon reading its outright refusal, flew into a rage and smashed everything in his study. Well done, Clara Blake. Just a ruined woman, and yet you dare to reject me? I will make sure you know that in this world, apart from me, Charles Anderson, no one else would dare accept you and your son. Abandoned by Eleanor Reed, William Blake could no longer endure a life of poverty. One late night, he jumped into the city moat and never returned. Eleanor Reed rented a shabby house for herself and her children. Accustomed to a life of luxury, her children found it unbearable to live in such darkness. Her son returned to the gambling den, taking all of her remaining possessions. A day later, he was beaten nearly to death and thrown out of the gambling house. Eleanor Reed held her bloodied son, crying desperately, but she had not a single penny to treat his injuries. Amelia Blake, once proud and aloof, suddenly felt as if the heavens had collapsed and the earth had crumbled. She wandered the streets like a soulless body, aimless and lost. Perhaps, she should follow her father's path, just close her eyes and jump into some moat to end it all. Amid her inner turmoil, she suddenly saw a faint glimmer of light. Within that radiance, a man in white robes rode a majestic horse through the bustling streets. His black hair fluttered in the wind, his white garments shimmering, and his expressive eyes looked in her direction. She felt breathless, her heart pounding wildly, and her vision filled with nothing but him. Before she knew it, she was secretly following him, weaving through the streets, from east to west. At the western end of the road, the magnificent residence of Prince One appeared. The man dismounted gracefully, handed his horse to a waiting servant, and strode leisurely into the estate. She followed in a daze but was stopped by an elderly steward. "Young lady, are you the new maid? Why are you alone? Weren't there supposed to be 3 of you?" Amelia Blake was startled, about to explain herself, but then thought better of it. The Blake estate was gone, her mother's last bit of wealth had been squandered by her younger brother. And she didn't even know how much longer she could stay at the inn. As for dinner tonight, that was still a mystery. Well, becoming a maid in the manor was better than wandering the streets, and besides, there was that young man too. Ironically, as soon as she signed the indenture contract, the old butler threw her into the servants' quarters. Day after day, she washed clothes and fetched water for the other workers. The white-clad gentleman was nowhere to be seen. Oh, why was her life so full of misfortune? The alchemist's grand assembly? Clara Blake raised an eyebrow, seemingly uninterested. Henry Owen poured tea for Clara Blake with a flattering smile and said, "Exactly right. The alchemist's grand assembly of the Eastern continent is held only once every 10 years. All the major powers send participants, and the rankings determine their prestige." Clara Blake shrugged indifferently. "What does that have to do with me?" Henry Owen chuckled obsequiously. "I want you to represent the Owens bloodline family." Clara Blake looked at Henry Owen as if he were an alien. "Are you crazy? Do you think I'd agree to that?" Still confident, Henry Owen grinned. "Have you ever heard of the Medicine Palace?" Clara Blake nodded. On the Eastern continent, the reputation of the Medicine Pavilion was legendary. As an alchemist, how could she not know? It's said that the Medicine Pavilion has the celestial spirit herb grounds, irrigated with celestial spirit jade water. No spiritual herb fails to thrive there, and any herb with a name can be found in the celestial spirit herb grounds. Clara Blake's eyes sparkled. The spiritual herbs needed to refine the blood essence pill were surely in the Medicine Pavilion. Unfortunately, the Medicine Pavilion was too mysterious, she didn't even know its location. Seeing Clara Blake's reaction, Henry Owen grew even more smug. The rewards for this alchemist grand tournament are provided by the Medicine Pavilion. The top 3 winners will be granted access to the Celestial Spirit Herb Grounds to select a rare herb as their prize. Before Henry Owen could finish his sentence, Clara Blake jumped up. "Deal. I agree to represent the Owens bloodline family, but the reward belongs to me. Any objections?" Henry Owen waved his hands quickly. "No objections, of course not." His handsome face brimmed with excitement. Finally, he had a reason to see Clara Blake more often. But when he thought of the fiery woman waiting at home, his mood deflated. Back at the royal mansion, Charles Anderson had been waiting in the front hall for a long time. When he saw Clara Blake strolling in leisurely with Peter, his gloomy mood from waiting instantly brightened, and a faint smile appeared on his lips. "Clara, you're back. His Highness, the second prince, has been waiting for you all afternoon." The fourth prince smiled at Clara Blake. Clara Blake glanced at Charles Anderson, her gaze calm and unruffled, then turned to the fourth prince and said, "Take Peter out for a little stroll, his grandfather has been worried." The fourth prince waved his hand and said, "Going out for walks more often is, of course, good. You two can continue your conversation, I'll go rest for a bit. Getting old always leaves one feeling tired." Clara Blake ignored the fervent gaze of Charles Anderson, directly leading Peter to sit down. She nonchalantly said, "I wonder if the second prince has something important to discuss?" Charles Anderson withdrew his gaze, lifted the teacup on the table, and took a sip to mask his earlier lapse. When he raised his head again, he deliberately replaced his expression with a cold demeanor and said, "I hope you can represent the Vermilion Empire's royal family at the Alchemist Conference happening in a month." Peter, who was just about to eat his snack, chuckled and said, "Uncle Prince, you're a step too late. Mother just agreed to represent Uncle from the Owens bloodline family at the Alchemist Conference." Charles Anderson frowned, looking at Clara Blake, and hurriedly asked, "Is what Peter said true?" Clara Blake shrugged and replied casually, "Yes, I've already agreed with Henry Owen to represent the Owens bloodline family." Charles Anderson's face darkened slightly with anger. That Henry Owen was truly audacious, knowing full well his intentions, yet still daring to. You must refuse Henry Owen and say you'll represent the royal family instead, Charles Anderson commanded, his expression firm and resolute. Clara Blake raised an eyebrow and replied, "Why should I listen to you?" A gentle remark left Charles Anderson speechless, but she wasn't wrong. Why should she listen to him? Who was he to her? What gave him the right to order her around? If I can get Henry Owen to change his mind, would you be willing to represent the royal family? Charles Anderson confirmed again. He admitted that Clara Blake was indeed very strong, but the royal family wasn't without other options. His actions carried a hint of personal motives. Clara Blake shrugged, showing no clear opinion. To her, it didn't matter who she represented, what truly mattered was who the ultimate reward would belong to. In the end, Charles Anderson failed to persuade Henry Owen. Despite being a prince, he couldn't use his status to force Henry Owen's hand. The Owens bloodline family held a significant position, and with their own internal strength, even the royal family couldn't disregard them. Left with no choice, he reluctantly selected another alchemist. Participants nominated by various factions had to go through preliminary rounds held in the capitals of their respective nations. Only the top 3 alchemists from each preliminary round would qualify for the finals of the Eastern Continent's most prestigious alchemist assembly. The final competition was set to take place in Clearwater City, located in the far south of the Eastern Continent, home to the headquarters of the Alchemist Guild. Today, the capital of the Vermilion Empire was bustling with excitement. Shops along the streets were closed, and the flow of people seemed to converge in one direction. At the southern edge of the city, at the base of the Purple River Mountain, lay an expansive martial arts arena. For years, the preliminary rounds of the alchemist competition had been held here, and this year was no exception. As dawn broke, the arena was already packed with onlookers. Many had camped out since the previous night to secure the best viewing spots. As the sky brightened, elders of the Alchemist Guild from various regions began entering the venue. These elders, all with white hair and beards, were seasoned veterans. There wasn't a single young face among them. An elder dressed in dark green robes announced the entry of the contestants and briefly explained the competition rules. However, as he scanned the scene, he noticed that the pathway designated for contestants, which had been prepared in advance, was now completely occupied by the crowd. The dense throng of people had surrounded the area, making it impossible to clear a path in a short amount of time. Chapter 39, Peter disappears. The alchemists waiting outside grew increasingly anxious, almost to the point of fainting. They only knew how to refine pills and had no understanding of martial arts. Seeing the thick crowd ahead, they were utterly helpless. At that moment, a pure white figure glided through the crowd and landed gracefully in the middle of the courtyard. Her black hair flowed in the wind, her eyebrows as delicate as a painting, as if she had stepped out of a masterpiece, breathtakingly beautiful. When the elders noticed the emblem on Clara Blake's chest, they were secretly astonished. So, she was the alchemist representing the Owens bloodline family? And she was so young, and a woman? Throughout history, alchemists were predominantly men. Female alchemists were rare, and among them, none had ever achieved the pinnacle of success. Yet, in such a high-level competition, the Owens bloodline family had sent a young woman to participate. Clara Blake's appearance caused a stir among the crowd. Her beauty was like that of a celestial maiden, her demeanor angelic, and every movement exuded an unparalleled charm. In previous competitions, the participants were always elderly men or middle-aged uncles. When had anyone seen such a young, beautiful woman? Truly a rare sight. Before long, all the contestants were escorted into the arena by martial arts experts, and the preliminary round of the alchemy competition officially began. A total of 68 contestants entered the vast arena, where 68 wooden tables were neatly arranged in rows. Each table bore the contestant's name along with the recipe and the required ingredients for pill refinement. Clara Blake was assigned to position 18 in the second row. Glancing at the name on the recipe, she couldn't help but chuckle. Vitality Nourishment Pill. It was merely a second-grade pill, a very common type on the market. If lucky, one could purchase it for just a few hundred silver coins. The ingredients for the pill were provided by the alchemy shop under the Owens bloodline family's management. They offered the ingredients for free, reclaimed the successful pills, and bore the losses for any failures. What a lucrative business! Being selected to participate in the competition, how could anyone fail to refine even a second-grade pill? Though they provided free ingredients, they could retrieve pills of greater value. Such a profitable venture, who wouldn't want to participate? Clara Blake retrieved her cauldron and began placing the ingredients inside one by one. A faint blue flame enveloped the dozens of ingredients, extracting their essence. She then fused the essences together, using her powerful spiritual force as an alchemist to control the flame's temperature. Gradually, the liquid and powdered essences merged completely, eventually forming a pill. Among the 68 contestants, apart from Clara Blake, the rest were middle-aged men and elderly participants, seasoned alchemists with decades of experience in pill refinement. Unfortunately, the achievements of an alchemist were not determined by age. A truly exceptional alchemist must have significant accomplishments at a young age, which is referred to as talent. These contestants, who repeatedly participated in the preliminary rounds, clearly lacked such extraordinary talent. They relied solely on years of hard work, but how could that compare to natural prodigies with an innate sensitivity to alchemy? In the first preliminary round, 32 contestants were eliminated, leaving 36 to advance to the second round in 3 days. As Clara Blake stepped out of the arena, Henry Owen hurried over, his face filled with panic. "Peter is missing." Clara Blake's face turned pale as she grabbed Henry Owen by the collar and shouted, "What's going on? Didn't I tell you to keep an eye on him?" Henry Owen looked regretful, admitting that he had been too engrossed in watching the competition earlier. "Peter said he was bored and wanted to find Uncle Quinn to play with, so I let a servant accompany him." Who would have thought the servant would lose him? Uncle Quinn? Julian Quinn? Without wasting time scolding Henry Owen, she pushed him aside and dashed off. Her movements were as swift as lightning, disappearing in an instant. Charles Anderson approached Henry Owen and asked, "What happened? Why is she like that?" Apart from the first time he met Clara Blake at the Crown Prince's residence, he had never seen her lose her composure like this. Henry Owen looked dejected. "Peter is missing." If they couldn't find Peter, he didn't dare imagine the consequences. "What? You idiot! How could you lose Peter? Don't you know he's Clara Blake's lifeline?" Charles Anderson angrily glared at Henry Owen, tempted to punch his handsome face into oblivion. Clara Blake sprinted all the way to the Sky Splitter Hall. The guards who tried to stop her were sent flying. "Peter Blake, come out here now." Clara Blake fought her way through, defeating 5 guards and 6 commanders. Her stamina was gradually depleting. This hall was unlike ordinary places. Just the patrol alone consisted of dozens of people, all skilled fighters above the 6th rank. Although they were no match for her individually, their numbers gave them an advantage. After a prolonged struggle, her energy was significantly drained. Another wave of patrol guards surged forward, ready to battle Clara Blake. At that moment, a figure in green flew toward them from afar. "Stand down." The patrol guards retreated respectfully to the side. Clara Blake also eased her stance, raising an eyebrow at the man before her. He was the same man who had accompanied Julian Quinn last time. "I am Gillian Sena, the left guardian under the hall master." "Greetings, Miss Clara Blake," Gillian Sena said with a respectful demeanor, clasping his hands in greeting. "Cut the nonsense. Where is Peter Blake?" Clara Blake cut straight to the point, her frustration evident. She had fought so hard, yet her son had not appeared. Was he waiting for her to collapse from exhaustion? When she found him, she would definitely spank his little bottom. Gillian Sena replied, "The young master went with the hall master to the back mountain to play. They said they were going fishing and haven't returned yet." "The back mountain?" Clara Blake lifted her gaze toward the lush green mountains behind the hall. Biting her lip, she thought, "Peter Blake, if I catch you, you're dead meat." Refusing the company of Gillian Sena, Clara Blake ran alone towards the mountain at the back. It was twilight, and a gentle evening breeze blew in, carrying the red, blood-like glow of the setting sun. She ran along the streams, searching for traces of the two people. Just as the sun was about to set, she finally found them by a stream behind the purple bamboo forest. On the bank, a fire was lit, roasting a few fresh fish. Meanwhile, Julian Quinn and Peter Blake were still in the water, catching fish and splashing around. In the last rays of the setting sun, the smiles on their faces were radiant and carefree. She realized she had never seen Peter smile like that before, a joy that came from deep within his heart. Suddenly, Peter slapped the water, and a large fish flipped over with its white belly exposed. Peter jumped up in excitement, but his feet slipped, and he fell back into the water. Seeing this, Julian Quinn immediately tossed the fish he was holding aside and grabbed Peter, ignoring his soaked clothes. He lifted Peter onto his shoulders, one hand supporting Peter's legs and the other picking up the fish from the water, his face full of laughter. Would anyone else treat Peter this way? Would Peter smile so brightly with anyone else? "Oh, Mother!" Peter's cheerful face instantly turned into one of guilt. He had sneaked off to the Sky Splitter sect, and his mother must have been frantically searching for him. She must be furious. Julian Quinn's smile grew even brighter as he carried Peter to the shore, laughing, "Arriving early is not as good as arriving at the right time. Wait a little longer, and the delicious food will be ready." Seeing the two of them like this, Clara's anger dissipated completely. She took Peter off Julian Quinn's shoulders and changed him into a clean set of clothes. #### Chapter 40, You should never appear again, Peter Blake. Do not repeat this mistake again, or you already know the consequences. Upon hearing this, Peter Blake's small, gloomy face suddenly brightened. Mother is the best. Then he planted a quick kiss on Clara Blake's cheek. Julian Quinn smiled, his dark, gem-like eyes sparkling. It seemed as though years of accumulated gloom in his gaze had vanished in that moment. He handed a freshly grilled fish to Clara Blake. "Try this, it's the legendary dish that could make a wife who left home return." Clara Blake chuckled, accepting the grilled fish. "I must taste it and see what kind of flavor can make a wife change her mind." She took a bite of the tender white fish from the belly, removed the bones, and fed a piece to Peter. Even before swallowing, the aroma lingered on her tongue. The taste was no different from the grilled fish she had eaten before, yet it seemed unusually fragrant. Perhaps it was because of hunger, she thought, while looking at Peter's radiant little face. Her mood lightened, and an unbidden smile graced her beautiful features. Julian Quinn imitated Clara Blake, carefully removing the fish bones for Peter and feeding him fragrant pieces of fish. Clara Blake paused her eating and looked across the fire. On that handsome face of his, there was such warmth, nothing like the cold, heartless man rumors described. Uncle Quinn, Mother said she wants to find the best father in the world for Peter. Peter likes Uncle Quinn. Can Uncle Quinn be Peter's father? Peter's chubby little hand clutched Julian Quinn's sleeve, his small face full of hope. Julian Quinn laughed, glancing at the flustered Clara Blake, and said with a smile, "That decision is up to your mother." Peter quickly turned to look at Clara Blake, blinking his almond-shaped eyes that resembled Julian Quinn's, and said, "Mother, I want Uncle Quinn to be my father. Is that okay?" Clara Blake sighed inwardly. If he wasn't Julian Quinn, if he wasn't Julian, perhaps he could have been Peter's father. She threw the firewood aside, stood up, picked Peter up, and spoke to Julian Quinn, "If Peter comes looking for you again, I hope you'll immediately bring him back to me. His illness could relapse at any time, and he cannot be away from me for too long, or the consequences could be dire." Pausing briefly, she added, "For Peter's sake, I hope you'll try not to appear around him anymore. Your identity is too unique, and I don't want Peter to get hurt because of you." The smile on Julian Quinn's face gradually faded. Standing silently in the night breeze, he watched her figure disappear into the distance and murmured softly, "What you're worried about, I will make sure it never happens." At the Duke's residence, a shadow, as swift as a phantom, slipped into the estate, moving with familiarity toward the Solely courtyard. Before entering, he noticed several other shadows in the wide courtyard, sneaking around as if searching for something. He tore off the black cloth covering his face, his cold, thin lips curving into a chilling smile. His tall figure stepped into the moonlight, standing under its cold glow. "Looking for me?" His perfectly shaped lips curved into a bloodthirsty smirk as he gazed at the figures before him, as if looking at corpses. "Are you Julian?" the masked leader asked coldly. Julian let out a derisive snort. "Assassins from the Dark Moon Tower who don't even know the face of their target?" The eyes of the masked leader narrowed behind the black cloth, radiating intense killing intent. "Whether you're Julian or not, tonight you must die." The leader signaled with his hand, and two tall, masked figures immediately lunged from both sides of Julian. The three formed a pincer attack, their palms charged with energy. Pale blue and light purple auras glimmered eerily in the dark as they executed their deadly technique without hesitation, striking straight at Julian. Julian shifted slightly, easily dodging the coordinated attack of the three assassins. The mocking smile on his lips deepened. Is this the extent of the Dark Moon Tower's skills? The masked leader's expression darkened. Though they hadn't directly clashed, the fact that their combined attack was effortlessly evaded, coupled with their inability to gauge Julian's strength, pointed to only one possibility. His martial prowess had reached the heavenly earth profound yellow realm, at least at the yellow tier. His energy was colorless and his aura concealed. Unless he attacked, he appeared no different from an ordinary person. No wonder their master had dismissed him as a useless man with no martial skills. Who would have thought that someone so young would have such profound martial cultivation? The masked man darted his eyes around, seeking an opportunity to flee. He knew very well that even if the three of them joined forces, they would stand no chance against a yellow rank expert. It was better to escape first, return to the Dark Moon Tower to report, and request reinforcements stronger than the yellow rank. However, Julian would never give him such a chance. Murderous intent surged out as his hands quickly formed seals. An overwhelming force, terrifying in its might, descended like a harbinger of death, sending chills down spines. The three didn't even have time to feel the pain of transitioning from life to death before their breaths ceased. Three tall figures slowly collapsed to the ground, lifeless. Julian, his face devoid of emotion, formed seals again, unleashing two palm strikes at the three corpses. A torrent of primordial energy, brimming with destructive power, turned the still warm bodies into ashes. Tranquility returned to Soli residence, while the Floral Grace residence on the other side was bustling with activity. Mother Consort, I truly like Ben Hope. I beg you, please grant me this wish. Billy Anderson knelt before the consort of Prince Juan, putting on a pitiful expression and persistently pleading with his mother. The consort of Prince Juan raised her snow-white hand to rub her forehead, her face showing helplessness. Her eyes, however, betrayed the affection she had for her son, though she maintained a stern demeanor. Count for yourself. How many women are already in your chambers? That vast Quinland pavilion of yours may no longer have space left, right? And now, you even dare to bring a courtesan from a brothel into the prince's residence? Do you still intend to inherit your father's princely title? Billy Anderson pouted and mumbled, with you around, mother, it's hard for me not to inherit it. The consort's expression darkened as she gritted her teeth and said, you ungrateful child. All my meticulous planning is solely for your future, and yet you dare to blame me? Seeing his mother enraged, Billy quickly smiled and said, Mother, you misunderstood.